Welcome to Big Brave Business. This is the podcast where we answer big questions reshaping entrepreneurship. I'm Sarah K. Heeter, and this is Season 3. Each week, I'm bringing on my friends, mentors, and some of the best thought leaders I know. We dive into bold, values-driven conversations about leadership, equity, ethics, and building businesses that actually make a difference. Ready to do business better? Let's dive in. Welcome back to Big Brave Business. Today, we're talking about trauma-informed leadership and management. And this concept of trauma-informed, if you've listened to this podcast for a while, which first of all, thank you, then you know that I kind of first started digging into this with Stephanie Belinsky talking about trauma-informed sales and marketing. And that honestly led to some light bulb moments for me that really changed the way I think about doing business. And so the whole concept of trauma informed is such a buzzword, but it actually does have really profound meaning. And I'm so looking forward to digging into this topic further, especially when it comes to like leadership and management. But before we do that, let's give you the lay of the land of whose voices you're even hearing on this conversation. And you're going to notice there's some familiar voices, I guess, some familiar voices on the podcast again this week. And I'm so happy that they're back. But let me start. So if you don't know me, I'm Sarah Heeter. I am the host of the Big Brave Business podcast. And I also run a podcast production and strategic consultation company called Podfox Media.
I'll jump in. I am Erica Blackburn. I am a spiritual coach and healing mentor, and I run a program called the Thrive Leadership Collective, and it really is for women who want to lead and live their lives in a trauma-informed way so that they can make a bigger and better difference in the world and in their lives.
Hi, I'm Amber Dancy. I am the founder of Practical Rebel, and I'm a leadership coach and human design expert. And I use human design to help you calibrate your life and your business.
And I am so honored to be with this group. My name is Kelsey Silver. I am a data analyst for founders and entrepreneurs. And I also am a trauma-informed therapist by training who transitioned into administration and data analytics. So super excited to have this conversation. Thank you all for having me.
What a great group. And I feel like I'm just so eager to learn from some specialists who really bring a level of expertise to this conversation. I always say about Big Brave Business, let me preface this before I actually pose the question. I always say everybody is invited to have these conversations. And I think it's so important that we really establish that you don't have to be an expert to have a big, brave conversation. In fact, we all are showing bravery when we are willing to have the big conversations that aren't in our areas of expertise. So I always invite people in who share the same kind of core values or are trying to do something when it comes to entrepreneurship or business leadership that makes the world a better place. That's really what I'm looking for when I invite guests in. And I always say, as long as that's aligned, all of us should be having all of these conversations, right? So I invite people in, but it sounds like there's some really good areas of expertise coming to this conversation about, and I think this is really important when it comes to this concept of trauma informed. So that's what I'm really looking forward to. But let's just get into it. So the big question this week is, how can trauma informed management, leadership, hiring, and onboarding create more compassionate and resilient workplaces?
It's a big, great question. I can kick us off in sharing that I actually really love the phrase trauma aware instead of trauma informed. In the sense we had talked about this, it's kind of a buzzword, but it's an important buzzword to understand more deeply, because I find trauma informed sounds like it's information, but trauma aware is that it's lived experience. And there are lots of different types of trauma. The majority of people have actually experienced trauma of some nature, but we all have stress responses, which is a form of experience of trauma in our body. So I really love talking about it as trauma in aware or nervous system literate, because it speaks more to where it's not only something that we read about or that we learn about, but that we actually have felt experience with. And I think that makes all the difference between it being something that can actually build compassion and resiliency or not.
I think there's something to be said for the semantics of it before. I mean, I come from a background in therapy, and when so I specialized in adolescents who had experienced sexual trauma and had resulted in drug use. That was my specialty. And that is a very different trauma than the trauma I work with presently, which is clients who have experienced trauma based on their data and their analytics and that sort of self-imposed and societally imposed trauma. And so I love, Erica, what you said, that beautiful trauma aware aspect, because as leaders, when we are leading a team, we don't know what degree or level of trauma exists within our organization, within our contractors, within our vendors. Those are all different levels of trauma. So as leaders, it's our responsibility to be aware of the different versions of trauma and informed on how to appropriately work with those people. When one of the practices that I used to use when I was actually in therapy is called seeking safety. And I also really loved that sort of phrasing as well, because another term that gets thrown around a lot is psychological safety, but no one really tells you what psychological safety is. So this concept of how can we create safer environments for ourselves and our staff members, our clients, and those in our ecosystem.
I love what both of you are saying. I think that really understanding that what we're looking for here is for, as a leader, to understand what is going on with the human in front of us and also ourselves, because I think that comes into the conversation as well. Because if a leader has enough awareness of both trauma, nervous system regulation, like how things are hitting and landing in their own body, then there's awareness of how they might actually be feeding or making things not safe from their own experience, not from even from the experience of the human in front of them. And a lot of times we go into this thinking that the leader is responsible for always being okay, as opposed to really allowing that this is more than just a one-way relationship, more than just a one-way conversation, more than just one person having an experience and another person having an experience, but we're actually in like an experience together. And if we get, I don't know how far down the rabbit hole we want to go here, but when we think about nervous system regulation, we look at it from that way as opposed to trauma informed or even trauma awareness. How I'm regulated in my nervous system is going to affect how you're regulated in your nervous system simply by being in the same vicinity with one another. So if one of us is having an experience, we're, even without awareness, sometimes creating an unsafe environment completely subconsciously. So for me, it's like, how do we bring back allowing us to, that's where the awareness comes from. So I really like, Erica, that you brought in like that piece of it.
I love, Amber, that you took it to a place of it being about your own, being informed or aware of your own trauma, in addition to, and Kelsey, I mean, you said this about the difference in your kind of clientele now versus previously, but I think that is something that felt like I'll say a misconception of mine about kind of the buzzword of trauma informed when I first heard of it. Like, just kind of from context clues, my assumption about the conversation around like trauma informed anything in caring for, I'll say, like clients and team outside of therapy, because trauma informed therapy seems like it should be default, like that should be on. And I say should, I understand that like things have come a long way and that all people are people and that therapists have their own trauma that they're bringing into the situation. So not all therapists are good therapists. That's a whole other conversation. That's really not the point. The point that I was trying to make is that I think there's an assumption, like same with, and again, I know this is not true, but in medical care, it makes sense to me that we'd be having a trauma informed conversation there. But for what I do, I help people start, launch, and grow podcasts. It doesn't necessarily strike me at face value of this is something that I need to talk about or learn about or be certified in like trauma informed, because no matter what somebody's like lived experience has been and what things they may have been through or maybe currently experiencing, when like they come to me and they want to pay me to edit their podcast or whatever it is, that just doesn't seem like necessarily part of it. But it is interesting to kind of consider the fact that, first of all, my own trauma shows up in the way that I communicate with clients, in the way I make decisions about how to run my business, in the way I manage my team. And like I mentioned in the big question, right, in hiring and onboarding people to begin with, right, there's how does my trauma show up in all those places? Then there's also this level of what are we doing that actually causes trauma or perpetuates trauma that we think is normal. And I say this because I definitely have had work experiences previously that taught me about how work is supposed to be, quote unquote, that were, I don't know, I can't say they weren't trauma informed, but they were trauma inducing. They were like from a place of trauma, then wanting to cause trauma to other people. And I know that sounds like intense, but I genuinely feel like that's what the kind of average 9 to 5 experience or like corporate experience looks like, where it's like you're punished for having human needs and you're made to feel like you have to leave your human needs at the door and they're like weaknesses. And especially women, like there's an assumption that we're emotional and that we're hormonal and that we have other things dividing our attention. And so if we have other needs, it just means we can't be as productive or innovative employees. So I feel like we have to like work twice as hard to prove that we can leave all the human at home, which is ridiculous. So anyways, all of this to say, that has been a big learning curve for me with trauma, the idea of trauma informed, that then when I go to be a manager, I learned about management from people who were managing from a place that tried to make me a certain way, right? Or try to treat me like less of a whole person. So I always tell my team, you're a whole person. As a team member of Podfox, you're a whole person. And Podfox is like literally never the most important thing you have going on. It's part of your life and I hope you care about it. Or I mean, I don't know why you would want to work for us in the first place, but it's literally never the most important thing. So what other important things do you have going on? That's literally always going to be a priority. So anyways, I think that's an interesting, I want to kind of say that for anybody who's listening who is, I don't know why this would be relevant to me. Like it's changed how I move through the world to have that understanding.
That's a really important recognition because, and particularly that last phrase, it changes how you move through the world. When you are aware both of your own traumatic experience and how it expresses itself, and how those around you express their own trauma and the impact that it can have on your expression, it's a completely cyclical reverberation, really, of energy between you and the world around you. And so in management in particular, when you're dealing with contractors, so I'm going to come at this from two different perspectives. When you're dealing with contractors or employees, coming from a person-centered perspective, which is a very therapeutic term, right? But it has started becoming a little bit more mainstream. But person-centered is you as the person, as a whole person, are the center of this decision, and you get to actually decide what is right for you. So coming from that person-centered perspective as a manager is really, if you just think of that person as being able to prioritize their own needs, you're already steps and bounds above where most people are going to find themselves. But from a client perspective, I found it very interesting. I did not think I would need to use my trauma training in the work that I do now. I am a data analyst. I crunch numbers, right? Like I get to tell people how to make more money. It's super fun. Except when I created one of my first dashboards, a client turned to me and said, "You use line graphs." And I said, "Yeah, you're going to trend track." She said, "I'm going to get lost." And I said, "What do you mean? Here's how you use it, blah, blah, blah." She realized that she was traumatized, for lack of better phrasing, in the context of this conversation, by dip in the line graph. And she would focus in on that low point to such an extent that she would ignore the fact that the trend line was going up. We had to completely change the visualization on her dashboard so that she wouldn't get hung up and could actually make informed data-driven decisions, all because of her past history. Now, not huge traumatic events, not getting fired, nothing like that, but a past history of having to dig into those things, being told, oh, this is wrong, this is a big glaring error. It's that constant reminder of failure. And so a dip for her was absolutely not going to work. And so we actually had to change the way we visualized data for her. And so once I realized that, and I got several others, even down to the colors that I used on dashboards. The red, you typically would think stoplight system, right? Super easy to understand, except burnt out, gifted, and talented kids that used to have red all over their tests that would tell them how wrong they were, and they see red on a dashboard, that brings up those feelings of failure, even if the red is simply telling them that they're off kilter a little bit and need to readjust. And so trauma can show itself in all these tiny little aspects. And if we're not aware of it, we just dismiss it or move on, or we try to overcompensate. And so when we talk as a manager or a business owner from this perspective, we really have to look at both. It's that person centered. What does this person need, and what are those tiny tweaks that we can make to create safety? But it's also about productivity. What safety can we create to ultimately give them the best result?
I think Kelsey brings up such a great point, because when we are centric on the individual, on the person, then there is opportunity for performance. There is opportunity for greater performance. There is opportunity for each person to shine in their own unique way. And I think that's such a beautiful example, Kelsey, because it even just shows the fact that you held a space where a client could say, this doesn't work for me and this is why. That's such a beautiful example of how you both benefited and you both grew from that experience. And that is performance. Like, that is better for the client. It is better for your business. And so I think there does need to be an understanding for people in business or people in corporate experiences that being trauma aware, being nervous system literate, actually allows people to be in a state of peak performance more often, because whether or not we have had big T trauma or small T trauma, we still have a purpose, we still have a destiny, we still have so much to give the world and to give the places that we work or the businesses that we contribute to. And so I think there might be a misunderstanding too in the trauma world, or the trauma-informed world, people who aren't as informed, that you can't have both. You can't have compassion and resilience and performance. And the fact is, if you have compassion and resilience, then you actually have better performance. And I think that is what is so beautiful about being trauma aware.
I want to kind of come back and touch on what I'm also hearing underneath this is like the reason to understand and become trauma informed, if that's the term that we're going to kind of go with, because it is the buzzword, is not so that we understand someone else's experience in the world, but rather understanding that that experience is so varied. I know for me, when I first started, I have a military background and come from a family history of mental illness. And it took me a lot of years to actually connect that I had trauma, because my brain said that trauma was something big. So you touched on big T, little t, Erica, but like I think it even becomes so much more subtle than that. That when we first started talking about trauma-informed practices in the workplace, I think sometimes people think we're only always talking about big T, very like well-known traumas. Like when we hear the word trauma, like we expect it to be big, when for in some ways I think it's almost more detrimental, those humans that have experienced the little t trauma consistently. I coin it when I talk to my clients and my team members as workplace PTSD. Like we all have those experiences of where we showed up in a way and were made to feel as less than or not enough or not okay, and however, and sometimes it goes back to our childhood, and sometimes it goes back to that first workplace experience, the boss that thought the only way to motivate you was to tell you how much you were screwing up all the time. That was my experience in the military. And that completely undermined how I showed up in my performance for years, long after I left that environment, long after I left those relationships, long after I actually even had very people-centered humans who were my managers. I still didn't know how to show up in that safety, even though they were willing to allow me to be a whole person. And so I think that that's a really important point to the conversation we're having, is that trauma is so varied that our awareness of knowing that how it shows up is really, really nuanced.
As managers, as leaders in our field, sometimes it can be very difficult to have someone in our space who does not show up the way we think that we have created a space for them to show up. And that can elicit, I know it does for me, I'll be very open and honest here. It does for me when I feel like I've created a very safe space and I know somebody's got something going on and they either, it's clear that they don't feel safe sharing that with me or they share it differently than I anticipated, that brings up my own trauma. Yep, yep. So I just wanted to highlight that because especially since we're talking about leadership here as one of the core pieces of our conversation, we also need to recognize that creating a safe space will not change the world. It is not necessarily going to force someone to, yeah, I thought this was, so let me rephrase. Let me rephrase. It is not necessarily going to change someone's ability to show up, but we are doing our part to create the catalyst for changing the world. Sometimes we have to just create the space and let the energy flow into it. That doesn't mean that we are a failure if someone doesn't start opening up. And in fact, a lot of times we don't want them to open up. We don't want them to re-traumatize themselves by oversharing with us, feeling pushed to share. No one needs to reiterate what trauma they have experienced. We are simply creating safe spaces, and that is enough sometimes.
Another kind of light bulb moment about all of this for me is we're all walking around traumatized. And I think this whole idea of like even big T and little t trauma, yes, there are specific instances that we can categorize or maybe analyze, and especially with a specialist who is trained and certified and safe for you and a good combination for you to like work through and build awareness of how things show up for you and affect you and what the triggering moments were. We all have those, and some of them are big and some of them are small, but the reality is that the capitalist system that we're living in, and I'm just going to take it here, right? We're just like taking the torch and going all the way in on being big and brave, which is the capitalist system that we're living in is built on the back of perpetuating trauma to each other, so that the whole system only works when we continue to traumatize each other as humans. And so everything, all of the input all around us, billboards and environments at school and commercials and media and literally everything, social media, literally everything is algorithmically programmed to continue to traumatize you so that someone can profit off it. And so I think that then that's all of that input that starts from the time we're babies, right? Very, very little. And we're getting all of these traumatizing inputs again and again and again and again, that whether you've experienced like what you would define as trauma or not, as far as like a traumatic incident in your life, we are all traumatized and we are all having trauma responses. And I think that that's part of why. And I think this is an important light bulb moment to call out, because for me, when I hired my first one-on-one coach like 4 years ago, when she would start to try to talk to me about building some nervous system literacy, that was where I first started learning about it. I had a huge aversion to feeling like I don't deserve to have a trauma response if I didn't have a specific categorical big T trauma in my life. So this isn't for me. I don't get to use that as like an excuse or a reason or a rationale, when the reality is, well, number one, we did uncover what are my triggering things, because we all have triggering things. But the reason we all have triggering things is we all grew up in the same corp to some degree. We all grew up in the same corporate capitalist machine. Now, depending on what part of the world you grew up in, what your parents tried to do, what school you went to, and I think this is the thing with now, there's a lot of parents who are homeschooling or who are putting their kids in alternative schooling. And there's pros and cons in those different environments too, right? As far as the drama. but we're all experiencing, we're all living in a state of trauma. And especially with the use of the depletion of our natural resources, the violations of human rights, the exposure that we have to mass violence, all of these things are perpetually re-traumatizing us at all times. So to me, trauma-informed management, leadership, hiring, onboarding gives us a chance, as you said, Kelsey, to be creating a safe space somewhere in this like capitalist hellscape that we're all just fighting for our lives. And at least if we can have psychological safety with each other, that is a port in a storm, quite literally, for each other. And so I think that's where, to me, how that creates a more compassionate and resilient workplaces. And I've shared this on a previous episode, but I also teach in addition to running my business at ASU. And one of the things is I have a very, very lax late policy. So students can, until final grades are due, they can turn in work and they have the opportunity to earn full credit. And to me, I always say to them, you're paying for this course. It's more important to me that you get something out of it than that I penalize you for missing a deadline. And even if when it comes up to the very final course deadline, if I have contact with the student, we can also do an incomplete. Then you have 12 months to complete the class. Like, honestly, it's more important to me that you get something out of it than that I trick you with a deadline. And I had a fellow professor who questioned me on what lesson is that teaching those students that they're carrying beyond your classroom. And I said, I hope it's teaching them compassion and resilience. I hope that it's something that they'll pass forward, that there's a light bulb moment that, like, what if we could just turn it in late? What if we could?
But it's also teaching them self-advocacy. And I think that's a really important part of trauma aware leadership, is that we're creating a space that's this safe space that we keep talking about. What it really is it's a space for self-advocacy. And that applies to both our employees and our clients, that applies to onboarding, that applies to all of these different pieces that we're touching on. The basis of all of this conversation is self-advocacy. And it's the putting your own oxygen mask on before you put someone else. Because if you can't advocate for yourself, then you are less able to serve your clients. Your clients are less able to serve their own clients, or their family, or whatever work that you are doing. So at the basis of all this is self-advocacy. So I would say, Sarah, that you are absolutely carrying that torch of self-advocacy with it.
Something that really I found important to learn and understand in trauma awareness is that we ultimately can do our best to create safe spaces, but we can't determine what is safe and what is not safe for someone. And so that meant a lot to me, because especially running group environments, like, I can do my best to create an environment that has nervous system literacy, that teaches tools and techniques, but ultimately my role, and I hope for other leaders and managers, part of their role can be that they know how to regulate, they know their own nervous system literacy, they know how they are showing up, what is coming up for them, so they can offer opportunities for co-regulation, but also so that they can not have expectations of what the other person is going to respond as, or what they're going to do with these so-called safe spaces, but rather that they understand that they can hold safe space. It may not be perceived that way. And so I think that's a really important piece, because yes, we can have safer spaces, but we can never tell someone what is safe for them, what is not safe for them. What we can do is, in the right environments, is share the tools and techniques that someone can learn and teach themselves and create more of their own safety within. And that kind of comes back to that piece around self-advocacy. I know on my journey, self-advocacy was a long time coming, but where it started was knowing how to do things for myself, for my own system and my own experiences. And then down the road, it became that I could speak to that and voice that and communicate. I feel like our gift of communication has not been as evolved as some of the other gifts of our nervous system. And so I think if that comes first, we can create more safety inside of ourselves to even have the opportunity to advocate or even receive someone else's advocacy for us. So I think that's an important piece for when we're using the word safe spaces.
what I have learned through my learning of being trauma informed practices and just my own like journey with therapy, nervous system regulation, somatic practices, tools, is that we all unintentionally traumatize each other, even on the best of days, with the best of practices, with the best of intents. And so, the other part that I would want to bring to the conversation when we're thinking about being leaders in the workplace, the ability to create both compassion and resiliency, is also that we have to be able to own that we unintentionally may have caused harm to another human being, even at the best of intentions, and be willing to have the conversation to clean up whatever that is. And ultimately, that's more important than whether or not you can even create the safe space to begin with. So when we link it together, when we're thinking about the ability to have self advocacy and the ability to ask for our needs to be met, what it requires as a team member is that you have a leader that can not only allow you to ask for those needs to be met, but that responds in a way that allows those needs to be met and allows that to continue to be a part of the ongoing relationship. And sometimes that means going back and cleaning up an unintentional slight or conversation or thing that maybe had nothing to do with you and everything to do with the other human's traumatic life and experience, that they like it's their trigger. Like, I can do my best not to be intentionally out here throwing things around and harming humans, because I think we wouldn't be here if we were going to be doing that. And also, it took me a while to actually own that even in that, I might still unintentionally cause harm. And that's almost harder than creating a safe space. That's almost harder than showing up. Like, I know as a leader, I'm going to come into a conversation and create as safe a space as possible. And also, I have crappy days. And also, I have my own things that spin my nervous system out of control. And I can come into a conversation and be not in the right headspace or the right energetic space or the right nervous system regulation to be having a conversation with someone. And so when we talk about compassion and resiliency, that needs to be part of the conversation as well. It's almost not enough to just know about trauma. It's almost not enough even to just be aware. There's a skill set that has to come with having a hard conversation, being willing to admit that maybe you did something wrong, and owning that two things can be true in the same capacity. So I can be in my highest and best intent, positive intent, and you can still have a negative response to this exact same conversation, the exact same experience, the exact same safe space.
Yeah. I think that a lot about reviews. So I have
Oh
a
my
lot
God.
of volunteer experience, and I formerly worked for Girl Scouts of the USA. And like, of the hundreds of thousands of members over the years, most of them have had a positive experience. And there are people who had extremely negative experiences, parents and kids, right? And I always think, like, when you hear the extreme story of somebody who had a negative experience, it's always, no matter exactly what you said, no matter how great this program and all of the training and the protocol and the support resources and this and that, somebody's still going to have a traumatic experience. Like, that's going to happen, and with the best of intentions, right? I think that's so true. And taking responsibility for what you can learn, and especially in with different people have different needs. So when it comes to management and leadership, like, people on your team or your mentees or whatever form of leadership, people need different things from you, and they need your leadership to look different depending on who they are and what they need. And so I think, like, being willing to learn and take responsibility is a big part of it. Just, nobody's a perfect friend, nobody's a perfect partner, spouse, nobody's a perfect parent, right? Like, we all mess up and we all hurt people we care about, right? And so I think that shows up in management and leadership as well. I'm curious what you all think with hiring and onboarding, this is something that I'd really like to take some time to interrogate, because I think this is so silly, but I think a lot of times if we can imagine how something would impact parenting, we can imagine how something can impact ongoing management, even though management doesn't need to feel like parenting. But I mean, it kind of is alike. So, but what could trauma aware and nervous system literate and like trying to build a more compassionate and resilient workplace in mind as a goal, what would hiring and onboarding look like?
Well, what if we just really sat with the idea that if we're not trying to intentionally traumatize a human being in the hiring process, we might actually have a really productive, helpful, engaged team member when they come to our team. And here's what I mean by that. A lot of the hiring practices, the way we've been taught to, for lack of a better word, interrogate human beings during the hiring process. We do this, there's a lot of parallels to the whole sales conversation in that too. But we're like trying to trick them. We're trying to ask them the triggering conversations. We're like the employer has been taught or the recruiter has been taught that we're looking for the holes in the person's story to make sure that we're hiring the best person. When in reality, if we looked at that from the perspective of what if I got to know this person who's in front of me? And what if we're making sure this is a values match in our organization? And what if, like, we're all going into this with eyes wide open that there is a values match, a skill set match, and there might also be a need that needs to be met once this person comes into our organization. I liken it to relationships when the honeymoon phase wears off, and all of a sudden you realize everyone's been like putting on their best face forward, and we had no idea this huge red flag like existed. And maybe that would have been a reason not to hire that person. And maybe that just would have been a consideration that we could have all gone in and known that. And that person could have been given care and taken care of from the moment that they walked through the front door. This, and maybe it kind of aligns with the capitalist belief of we have to have the best and we have to have the one, there's this magical one unicorn person that is going to like fill this slot. When the truth of the truth is like, there's lots of human beings who can probably do the job that you've put out there. What we want to make sure is like, this is a match for them and a match for us, and that we're both on both sides making a clear, aligned, well, and as informed as possible, yes, to entering into relationship with one another, because that's what we're doing. It's not transactional. We think it's transactional. We think business is not personal. I won't go on that. I won't stand on that soapbox, but it really is like, what if we could be a little bit more real in the process and all come into this knowing that that's how it gets to work when we enter into this relationship?
This kind of almost takes us back to the beginning of the conversation when Amber was referencing like what's happening inside of ourself and do we know our own, and I sometimes like to call it stress responses, because sometimes the word trauma does make us think that, oh, well, I don't think and I had that experience too. I didn't know I had trauma until 2 years into trauma therapy. And I was like, do I have trauma? My therapist was like, well, yes. And I was like, oh, I didn't realize. So yes, it can take a while. And some of it is, it's all different experiences. But I think if in a corporate setting or in a business setting, we think about it like stress responses. We all have a nervous system. Every single one of us has stress responses. Some of those are more amplified because we have also had acute or chronic or complex or systemic trauma experiences as well. But I think sometimes when we're talking about hiring and onboarding, we're thinking about the person on the other side of the table, like the candidate. Well, what if they have trauma? What if they don't have trauma? And it's, well, what about the manager? What about the leader? What about if we know what's happening inside ourselves? We literally might approach the entire process of hiring and onboarding differently. And just to add to what Amber shared, agree with all of that. And then because we're approaching it differently, the conversations might turn out different. The communication might turn out different. Like we almost can't imagine it from where we sit today unless all of us as managers and leaders have this awareness, know how to work with our own body, feel comfortable and safe connecting with our own body. Only then could we even say what might be possible for the person on the other side of the table. It really truly does have to start with us. And for my own experience, I have noticed my own onboarding and hiring look different because of my knowledge and experience of my own trauma awareness, nervous system literacy. And they weren't all like beautiful experiences, but they had messiness to them, and both people were okay. And I think that is important too. Like, it doesn't mean we're going to create this beautiful, like, utopia just because we're aware of all of this, but both people can be okay. And when I was noticing the person on the other side of the table having a trauma response, it did not trigger me into trauma, into my past trauma. It allowed me to still hold a regulated space for them, however they were going to show up. And I did not hold it against them. I did not judge them. I knew that their body was having an experience that I was not responsible for. And yet here we were experiencing it in the same time and place. And so I think it does have to start with each individual manager, each individual leader. And nobody wants to hear that because everybody wants to hear that, oh, if you just do this process differently, and if you have this 5-step process for how to communicate, and it's really not that. It really has to be, what is your level of comfort with your own body and experiencing what's happening in your own body and your knowledge and awareness of that stress and or that trauma. And then when you go into any circumstance with any other human being, then we'll see what happens. We need a lot less stuff involved if we can start there. And then the answers almost reveal themselves in the given moment that we're in. That's just been my experience personally.
I fully agree with that, Erica. I think so. I look at most stress responses as a product of power and power imbalance, right? If you think about it. And I mean, we can get to the whole misogynistic, societal aspects of that, et cetera. But for the purposes of this conversation, when we're really talking about someone sitting across us from us, and this harkens back to what Amber was saying, what if we just didn't play with the power? What if we simply didn't lord our power over the candidate, right? And didn't anticipate that we have power because we are determining where their life is going to go over the next however many years. What if we simply acknowledge that we are talking to another human? And I'm repeating, Amber, what you said, and I recognize that it's repetitive, but I think it's worth really hearkening to is that when we acknowledge that most stress responses are in response to power, we then have the power to reduce that power. And that in ourselves, as you were saying, Erica, is a really beautiful way to start recognizing how is my executive decision making being impacted by my response to the power imbalance that's occurring. So in the hiring conversation, am I having a little bit of a power trip? How is that impacting my executive function? How am I understanding the power dynamic that's happening? And this is hard to acknowledge for some people, but am I kind of liking the fact that they're a little bit intimidated? If I am, how is that impacting my executive function and my decision making in that very moment on how I ask the same question I would have asked someone who is not having a response, a stress response to me? Because I guarantee you might be asking that question differently, even if it's just your tone of voice. And so being aware of the way that you're reacting to power, just like Erica, you've been saying, is really impactful to then take a step back and identify how is this impacting my executive functioning, my decision making, and the way that I'm presenting myself.
I think that is such an interesting and beautiful direction to take it to bring it back to this idea of the power dynamic, because I think that a lot of times this kind of wraps everything you all said together, is that a lot of times when we're acting from a place of like lording our power, or you like overreaching with power, or even just playing with power, right? Being in the power dynamic where we're the one who has the power, that often comes from a stress response or a trauma response to have ever felt powerless. So this is a way to get autonomy back. And it becomes like this tug of war situation where everybody's grappling with having felt powerless, especially at work. And yeah, I think that's really interesting. The other piece that I wanted to kind of just summarize back is this idea of not trying to hack the system of hiring. And I think anytime we're trying to hack a system, that's like a pretty good indicator that this is a stress response or it's a trauma response, right? Where we're trying to have control over something that we feel is out of control. So hacking algorithms, hacking, how do you hire the best person? Or when you're the candidate, how do you get the job? How do we hack the system? How do we hack the process? Instead of just getting to show up and asking mutually, is this a good fit? And if it is, does the budget align with your monetary needs? And if so, and do we both want to work in the same way, or can we figure out how to meet in the middle? And if the answer is yes, let's move forward. I mean, it could really just be that simple. So, but it doesn't feel like it because we're all coming to the table carrying our own, everybody, both people on both sides of the table is trying to hack the situation, right? Instead of just showing up as people. So I think that's an interesting kind of perspective. So anyway, thank you so much to each of you for being here with me. This time flew. I really, really appreciate all of the like grace and empathy that you all showed up with. I appreciate that so much. And to you listening, thank you so much for being here as well. If you want to connect with any of the beautiful people on this call, because of course you do, our bios and our links and everything like that to connect with us is in the description or the show notes of the episode. So please go and connect with us there. Tell us the things that you have been your light bulb moments when it comes to these kind of concepts of trauma informed, trauma aware, nervous system, all of that stuff, safe spaces, and also what your kind of thoughts or tips around management, leadership, hiring, and onboarding might look like. Literally everybody on this call is interested in knowing what you think. So we want to have these conversations in the DMs. So please go ahead and do that. And again, you can find all of our links and everything like that in the description. But thank you so much for being here. And we'll see you next week.